I'm sure you have lovely sweater knits like this in your fabric collection, and maybe you're wondering if you need to do anything special with them before sewing them, or what special precautions can you take so you can have an amazing sweater. This video is all about sewing with sweater knits, very practical. Stay tuned. Hi sewing friends, I'm Karina from liftingpinsandneedles.com. Welcome to this channel that is all about sewing, limitless sewing, and today I have prepared a special video for you. I've taken my time to get everything ready so that it's a really good resource for you. And this is all about sewing sweater knits. I'm sure you have some in your stash. Maybe you look out for them because you like to sew with them. You like making cardigans and sweaters for the cooler weather. I have a hard time finding these types of fabrics here in Brazil. So when I see them, I snatch them up, and I really enjoy sewing them and having these special garments. I thought this video would come in handy as a lot of you are sewing, as a lot of you are preparing to sew things for when your weather gets cold. You see in a lot of pattern fabric recommendations the mention of sweater knits, and maybe you are experienced with them, maybe you've never sewn with them. I hope there's something in here for everyone. I have gathered 18 of my best tips so that you can have amazing results. I have divided these 18 tips into 5 big areas. One of them is pre-washing or preparing your fabric. The other one is cutting your fabric. Number 3 is sewing your fabric. Number 4 is pressing it. And number 5 is storage. Sweater knits are typically more delicate than your other knit fabrics, your jersey fabrics. Those types of knit fabrics like cotton lycra, athletic knits, even rib knits, the threads are a little bit finer and closely woven together. You'll find spandex in there, and they are fabrics there that aren't that delicate as sweater knits, where you'll find a variety of really thin sweater knits, really heavy ones, and some that are fairly closely woven, quite dense, and others that are very loosely woven. So it is generally a fabric that can snag, stretch out of shape, and just behave in a manner that is unpredictable to you, maybe if you've never sewn with that type. So I would be very careful about just throwing this in the wash and just using your regular cycle. Now I would say you really need to wash it. You know, your fabric could shrink. You need to get rid of grime and chemicals that are in the fabric anyway. You really want to work with clean fabric that has had a chance to soften up, you know, stretch out a little if it needed to, or shrink, so that you don't have any unpredictable results after you've completed sewing your garments. So in my personal preference, I would hand wash these knits. Just put them in a bowl of warm water with a tad of detergent and just gently move them around and just treat them as delicately as possible. I know a lot of our washing machines have a hand wash cycle, which is a really delicate cycle as well. That is another option. If you have a serger, I would suggest you serge the raw edges of your fabric so that they don't fray. Differently to other knit fabrics like cotton, lycra, or all the other types of regular fabrics, those don't tend to fray, but because these are more loosely woven, you might actually get some damage to those raw areas. So just be careful. If you just throw it in the dryer, that is your choice, of course. It wouldn't be my choice, just because I'd be worried about it shrinking and just deforming. It is generally not recommended, but you know, if you are adamant that you want to dry your things in your dryer, go ahead and see what result you get. I can't really say because I don't have a dryer. I would try to find a way to get them to dry up on the flat, on top of a table. Now I don't have a table in my garden. I have these bushes that are sort of square. I don't know the name of those things. I don't know anything about gardening, by the way, but they are perfect. If I put them out there pretty flat and extended in the sun, they'll be dry in like less than 30 minutes. So I just keep an eye on at them and just get them as soon as they're dry. The weight of sweater knits when it's wet will just start stretching out if you just hang it on a line. So I would really avoid hanging these when they're wet. Just get them to lie flat somewhere until they dry, and you'll be fine. Now when you're cutting your fabric, this could be obvious, and it's obvious for any type of fabric really, but especially important for sweater knits. Just don't let your fabric hang from your table. You can see a picture I took there deliberately before cutting one of my projects, just to show you what not to do. If you have a lot of yardage, just scoop it out from one side and lay it on the end of the table, so you just have enough on your table to cut what you need, and you don't have the weight of this knit hanging there and stretching out of shape while you're cutting it. Tip number 4, because these are delicate fabrics, you have a better result by just using pattern weights and a rotary cutter. For pattern weights, I use anything I have that will provide weight, be a stapler, a cup, a glass of water, like whatever, I will just put on there. I don't have like specific pattern weights, and I'll just cut along with my rotary cutter. If you're trying to do this with the scissors, you know, when you lift the 2 layers of fabric, you might distort the fabric and the way that you're cutting, and you end up with a result that's not so accurate as if you did it with the rotary cutter. Now, one thing I have to mention here, depending on your type of sweater knit, you might want to cut a larger seam allowance, and I'll touch on this again when I mention whether to sew this with your serger directly or sew it with the sewing machine and finish the edges with the serger. You might have a sweater knit that the fibers are really large. You can actually see how it's been woven, and it's fairly loose as well. Similar to this is quite large and loose, and if I just cut this with a regular seam allowance, say your pattern just had a 1/4 inch seam allowance because it was designed to be sewn directly on the serger, you might not get good results on the seams. And because these threads are so large, they'll just come right out of your serger stitching. I'll show you an example here with the Gothenburg top. I've sewn a little piece so you can see how loose this is and how easy it is for the threads from the weave to just come out of the serger, which is not great. This is what happened with my Gothenburg top from each stitch I made at the beginning of the year. This one was designed for a 3/8 seam allowance, so that is awesome. But I actually did sew it that way. I sewed it with the sewing machine at 3/8 and then I serged it, and then I'm making sure that as I wear this, you know, nothing's going to come undone and I'm not going to end up with holes on my seams, which could happen. Just have a look at your knits. Some might be more closely woven and have a smaller thread, and you'll be pretty fine to just sew with a really small seam allowance. But for this, for example, if my pattern called for a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I would just increase the pattern slightly to have at least 3/8 so that I can sew it with the serger and the sewing machine and have enough on the seams so that they won't start unraveling over time. So have a look at that. I think that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is the smallest seam allowance you could do with a knit like this, like the one I've just shown you, where it's just loosely woven, large threads, you can see everything there. I think you'll be safe with 3/8, definitely not with a 1/4 inch. Now, number 6 is not to cut notches. You know, when you snip into marks that will serve as references to put your pattern pieces together. This is general practice that I don't do for anything at all. Any fabric you'll never ever see me cut, which is really common. You see a lot of people do that, and it's really fast and you don't have to worry about marking tools because your scissors is right there. But specifically with sweater knits, you might end up with holes later. You are cutting into the seam allowance, which could be already small. It would just weaken that area. You might end up with a hole down the line. You definitely don't want to cut into notches. You can use chalk. You can use a pin. Just thread your pin several times through the mark. Leave it there until you're ready to line things up. Or, you know, a more fancy way would be to do some thread marking, which I will never do. Oh my gosh. I just cannot take the time to do that, but if you want to, that's a really accurate way to have a mark last. In my personal sewing practice, I use chalk and it works and it lasts, and I'm fine with that. I'll be able to line up everything nicely, and it takes a very short time to make those marks. The next tip is about needles, and you probably know already about the types of needles you need to use with knit fabrics, because if you've been sewing regular knit fabrics, you will probably have ballpoint needles or stretch needles in your stash. Now, to your eye, especially like me, if you can't even see and you need glasses, when you just look at a needle, you can't tell. They all look really pointy. But then if we could blow it all up, I'm showing you an image here of the difference between a ballpoint needle or a stretch needle compared to like a denim needle or just a regular needle, a universal needle where it's really, really pointy. You can see that with these specialized needles, it's not as pointy, and the needle, when it goes in and out of the fabric, will just push through the fibers without making holes in them, which is super important because you don't want to end up with holes down the line from having used a regular needle with your sweater knit project. So that is super important. And you can also get needles for your serger that are ballpoint needles for sergers. That is very important as well if you're just sewing directly on the serger and for your project that is made with a sweater knit. This is a Terra tunic I made a little while ago, just recently, and this is a very fine sweater knit. It's very soft, very lovely. This one has a slit there on the sides as a feature, and I've sewn the side seams and pressed the seams open, so I didn't serge them together, although they are serged on the edge. The seam was sewn on the sewing machine. And for vertical seams like this, like the seams of side seams or the seam of sleeves, you can actually use a straight stitch and you won't run into problems. If you are really accustomed to using a shorter stitch length for your woven projects, say a 2.2 or 2.5 or something, I would advise against that. I would suggest you lengthen your stitch length to a 3.0 at least when you're sewing a sweater knit, because a shorter stitch length just typically tends to stretch out these sweater knits. Now I have filmed an example for you. I've got two little pieces of sweater knit, both the same size, everything like that. And on this first one, I'm sewing it with a straight stitch with a 2.0. So I'm just sewing along, I'm going to put that aside, and for this other piece I'm using a 3.0 stitch length, a straight stitch. And when you put them side by side, you can see that the one that has the shorter stitch length just ended up stretching the seam. The seam on that side looks longer, it looks a little bit wavy even, and that is all you want to avoid when you're sewing your garments. You can also use a shallow zigzag for these seams. A shallow zigzag almost looks like a straight stitch. It's just that the width of your zigzag is very shallow, it's very tiny, 0.5 usually, and then the stitch length of your zigzag will also need to be a tad longer than you usually use. So a 3.0 would be good, 0.5 width, 3.0 length, and you have a seam that looks almost like a straight stitch but will allow some stretch. Why am I saying that you don't need these to go on vertical seams? Usually sweaters don't have negative V's, they're usually looser garments. You don't need your garment stretching down vertically, so I wouldn't think it's really that important. For areas that are more horizontal on your body or that need that stretch, like armholes and necklines, maybe you're sewing on a hemband at the hips that brings it all in. For those seams, you really do need a shallow zigzag stitch. A straight stitch is going to pop, it's not going to work. So this is where the shallow zigzag is going to work. A longer stitch length, a small width, it will look almost like a straight stitch, but you'll have a seam that will stretch and will allow you to move, and you'll be perfectly fine there. Number 10 is something I never do, but it's really good, and I actually took out my walking foot, changed my presser foot, and sewed a little bit for you to see. Now when you just sew with a regular presser foot, you have the feed dogs moving the fabric from the bottom and your regular presser foot on the top just sliding the fabric along, and that's where sometimes it doesn't match and you end up with a wavy seam or a stretched out seam. So when you're sewing with a knit fabric, a walking foot is always really helpful. Specifically with a sweater knit, could be extra helpful. The walking foot has its own little feed dogs on the top as well. You have the feed dogs at the bottom and the walking foot on the top feeding the fabric in a uniform way. That means that the top and the bottom are going to be the same and they won't stretch out unevenly and end up stretching out and looking wavy. The reason I don't use it is because I have a good result with my regular presser foot. It doesn't really affect me, and every time I want to switch it back, I have to use my screwdriver and take out part of the presser foot to put it back. I'm just lazy. But if you are used to using it and you like the result of a walking foot for other projects, go ahead and bring it out for your sweater knits and you'll be really good. You'll have a great result. The next tip is about sewing your seams either with a serger or with a sewing machine. I'm showing you here with a sewing machine, and I think a lot of people have this practice that is not good practice, by the way, is that a lot of sewists grab the fabric from behind the presser foot and in front and sort of push it along as the machine is sewing, and it's like people say they're giving the fabric more tension or something, but it's just not good practice with any garment. You just need to let the machine do its job and let the feed dogs do their job. If you're stretching the fabric as you sew, you're going to end up with this huge stretched out seam or wavy or distorted. Very bad idea to do, especially with a sweater. You're going to end up with side seams that look like this. It's just not going to look good. I filmed again what is a better idea, either with the serger or with the sewing machine, especially with a sweater knit. Just hold your fabric in both of your hands. Don't let it hang on your lap if it's a long seam. Don't let it just dangle down, because that's going to make the fabric stretch out. Just hold it as the sewing machine is doing its job, either with the serger or the sewing machine. So that is a good tip. Actually, for any project you're doing, this could also work if you're doing something in a woven fabric cut on the bias. Same thing, don't let it hang, just hold it in front of you and just guide it along, but just don't let the fabric hang. That's what I mean. Number 13 is super important. Now, these types of fabrics don't have much spandex, or if they do, they don't recover that well at all. And so you really do need to stabilize the shoulder seams. I have done that with all of my sweaters, all of my cardigans. You can see this one here. And there are two options I'm going to show you. Depends on what you're sewing. You know, if you're sewing directly on your serger, maybe a piece of clear elastic could do the job really quickly, all in one go. You're sewing your shoulder seam and stabilizing with clear elastic. With this one, I decided I did want to keep the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on my shoulders, and I wanted to stabilize with a little piece of woven. These are the shoulder seams there, and this fabric is super stretchy. I've devised a way to stabilize that. I can't really fuse interfacing here. I don't trust it will stay fused on, so I'm not going to do that. What I've got here is just a piece of woven cotton, not on the bias, just straight. It's 3/4, and I've just pressed it in half, 3/8 plus 3/8. Raw edge will be right there, and when it gets serged onto the cardigan shoulder seam, that raw edge will be finished and it won't fray. So it'll be super neat, and it'll just keep these shoulders from stretching out of shape. Okay, here you can see it done. You can see I've serged the edge right there, so that prevented that raw edge from fraying. And then I've just sewn my shoulder seam at 3/8 with a straight stitch. I don't need this to be stretching, and that catches that right there, and now I have stable shoulders and it looks pretty. When I press this seam, it's going to go towards the back and you won't even see that. You could use a piece of ribbon as well. Twill tape, I'm on the fence about twill tape because sometimes it's really thick. Maybe if you have a really thin one. Anything woven can also stabilize your shoulder seams. If you skip stabilizing shoulder seams over time, your sweater is just gonna droop and deform. Your sleeve's gonna look all wonky all down there. You might think, you know, this is not fitting correctly. It's just because the item has deformed over time. These seams are horizontal, the fabric doesn't have much recovery, prone to stretching out, so protecting the shoulder seam is going to give you a much better result. If the pattern you're making has an option to use a hemband, that is a great way to hem sweater knits. It's so much easier. You don't need to worry about actually hemming it, because a hemband is just a band that's double and sewn on the round. You have a seam there, but at the bottom of the garment actually you have a fold instead of a hem. So if you have that, great, use that option. It's going to work great for your sweater knits. Otherwise, I like to just fold up and use a twin needle. I like to hand baste my hems first, make sure it's all even all the way around, and use a twin needle that has maybe 3 millimeters, and that always gives me a good result with a longer stitch length as well, 3.5. And just go slowly and evenly and you'll be fine. This is one of the ones I've done recently. It's not wavy, it's not ugly, it's really, really nice. I'm not mad about this result at all. And you can just use your regular sewing machine for that. Now, you've noticed I haven't talked about using the serger directly, and it's because I'm going to talk about it now. If you've decided that your sweater knit is okay with just the serger, if you're okay with having that tiny seam on the side, usually turns out to be about 1/4 inch. The serge seam width is about that width. So you can do that for sure. Just make sure your serger has a 4-thread function. It'll give you a much more stable seam. Something is not going to open up over time. And that's why with my older sergers, I was not sewing directly on my serger. Items I've made in the past, like this boyfriend cardigan, they all have seams sewn with the sewing machine, and then I've just used the serger to clean up the edges because my old serger was just a 3-thread serger. But if you have a 4-thread serger, you'll be very, very safe to sew with your serger. If your fabric isn't like this one, like I've shown you in the past. My Breckenridge Henley sweater that I just made a few days ago, I thought this one was going to be okay just to be sewn directly on the serger, and my seams are just serged. I don't have a sewing machine go through this garment. I only used it to sew on the neckband and do all this Henley placket business. Otherwise, the rest is all done with the serger. If you have a serger with differential feed as a function, this is going to help you greatly. And I've sewn 2 little samples for you to see. Now, recommendations, if you're sewing with a sweater knit, increase your differential feed so that the fabric feeds more evenly throughout on the top and the bottom layer. Also increase your stitch length. And similar to what you did with your sewing machine, where you're using a longer stitch length, the same applies for the serger. So I've cut out 2 little pieces as well to show you the difference. The first one I'm going to sew with a 1.0 differential feed, which might be like the regular settings on a serger. And I'm going to use a 2.0 stitch length, which could also be a super regular setting if you're sewing woven fabrics with your serger. Now the second one, I've sewn it with the settings that I would prefer, just a higher differential feed 1.5, a longer stitch length 3.0. You can see them side by side, how this one didn't increase its length, it didn't really stretch out at all. When I open it, the seam looks nice and neat, whereas the other one looks all wavy and stretched out. So those are things that you can experiment with your own knits and your own machine. Please practice on scraps before you actually start sewing your project, so that you're really happy with the settings that you're going to use, both on the sewing machine if you're going to use it for some of the parts of the garment, and the serger. It's up to you whether you want to mix and match how to sew your garment. I've shown you lots of examples so you can choose. You know, you've seen that for me, there are seams I sew on the sewing machine and others on the serger. Some garments mainly on the serger, others mainly on the sewing machine. Something super important is about the way that you press your fabric. You want to use a lower heat setting, and when you press your seams to one side or the other, maybe you want to just use the tip of your iron to just iron the seam and not just press the whole garment. You might end up making the fabric shiny or flat. And the other thing is stretching it out. Now I remember when I was little and I got hand knit sweaters from my grandma and they got really small. I remember my mom be like pressing it sideways to make it stretch and like stretch out on purpose so that it would fit me. You don't want to do that with these. If you stretch it out sideways and just like mechanically stretch out and steam your fabric as you go, you can end up with something really deformed. Just be careful with the way that you press it. You know, I like to just hold it up on a hanger and just steam it with my iron. Just press the button and just steam it like that. You'll get rid of most of the larger wrinkles if there are any. And for the seams themselves, just use the tip of the iron and that'll be all fine, all you need. And the last tip, number 18, has got to do with how you store it. Now you can see these examples I've pulled out are in hangers. I only have them here so that I could have them there neatly and show them to you. But I would not store them this way. You know, you're gonna end up with your sleeves stretching out, all of this just stretching out and deforming if you just store them like this. Much better to store them folded. Whether you do that on large drawers that you have for that purpose, just fold them and keep them nice and flat. A shelf, of course, would be fine. If you go to a shop, you rarely see sweaters like this for sale on hangers. You'll usually see them folded up in shelves. They know what's not going to deform the clothes. I suggest you do the same thing. Now, you know, it could be really nice to store them like that because you can just see them easier, but they are going to last longer if you just fold them and store them in a shelf or in a drawer. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you got some practical tips for your own sewing and you can put them all into practice when you're making garments out of sweater knits for the cool weather. I hope you enjoyed this. Please subscribe, like, share if you find all this content helpful. And that's it from me. I will see you again very soon with more sewing. Bye.